So last lecture we ended briefly on soil structure and dispersion and slaking. So just reiterating, dispersion was really the mobilization of clay particles and flocks, groups. The flocks are groups of attached clay minerals. And essentially you make a cloudy solution of clay particles. That is obviously easy to mobilize, right? Then we have slaking, which is actually the breakup of aggregates into smaller aggregates. And the combination of these two things, along with some biological factors, can actually lead to sealing of surface soils, leading to the formation of soil crusts. Right? And soil crusts impact the hydrology. They also make soils more or less susceptible to erosion. So we're going to have a brief talk now about soil crusts and what they are, how to look at them, and maybe thinking about putting them back if your soil actually needs them or not. This is a new thing in rehabilitation that is a bit challenging, so I'm going to talk about it. So there's two types of soil crust. There's physical soil crust and biological soil crust. So biological soil crust, as you can imagine, caused by cyanobacteria and algae in soil. They live off the water that's briefly in the soil surface, and they photosynthesize, right? And being near the soil surface, they can get a bit of sunlight, a bit of energy, and fix carbon through the combination of water, nutrients, and sunlight that they get. Biological soil crust can be formed by lichens and liverworts. There's a picture of some of those. And mosses and other types of lichens. And they occur all over the world in all types of environments, but generally speaking they occur where you have less plants, right? And typically well, for you guys, you're going to be dealing mostly with hot deserts. And they're widespread throughout Western Australia. And they occur either as flat, almost completely flat microtopographies. And you walk around and you walk on the soil and you hear a little crunch underneath your feet. And that's very often not just soil structure, but a soil crust that's resulted from some biological activity. You can also have rugose soil crusts with a little bit of microtopography. And in cool deserts, you can have rolling, quite large microtopography, or pinnacled, right, where they actually start to grow vertically up. And probably because they're competing for sunlight and they're rather energy limited. So what are the factors impact biological soil crust? What are their ecological relationships? Well, generally speaking, where we have low vascular plant cover, so low plant cover, we generally have higher total crust cover. Okay? And we have higher plant cover, we have lower crust cover. So they're competing, right, for resources. Those are the two things. And vascular plants seem to do well where we have enough water to keep them alive. And the biological soil crusts obviously do better where vascular plants don't do so well. We also tend to find total crust cover increase at low elevations, and they're less prevalent at higher elevations. In Western Australia, where our highest relief is just a few hundred metres above sea level, then really that's not so much of an issue here. Okay, other things that soil crusts are that control soil crusts, they tend to occur on shallow soils more often and have a higher cover than over deep soils. And they tend to occur on finer textured soils as compared coarser textured soils. So soil crusts affect soil stability. They impact how much water infiltrates in the soil. They impact the fertility of soils. They are very susceptible to disturbance. So cars driving over the surface or getting them back on post-mining landscapes can be a real challenge. disturbance of these crusts can actually lead to loss of things from the landscape. So loss of organic matter, loss of fine soil particles, loss of nutrients, and also loss of microbe populations, which are important for nutrient cycling and so on. Right, so that was biological soil crust. What about physical soil crusts? So they are caused by raindrop impact. They are caused by migration of clay particles and filtration of those in soil, vesicle formation, and clay skin orientation. And I'll give you a guide as to what some of those things are right now. So we can classify physical crusts into a bunch of different things, and most common are disruptional seals and depositional seals. I'll show you what those are. So disruptional seals, they're formed by slaking crusts. So we get the breakdown of aggregates into smaller aggregates, and as a result we get smaller pore spaces between the larger soil particles. So we get the breakdown of larger soil particles, they form smaller soil particles, which leads to smaller pore space. We get infilling crusts. So what happens is the larger aggregates break down, the pore spaces are then infilled or clogged by smaller aggregates in the interstices. We get coalescing crusts. It's the gradual compaction due to aggregate coalescence and raindrop impact. Okay, so aggregates come together, and then the pore space between them is lost or made smaller because they're being compacted somehow. And then finally we get sieving crusts. Right there, we basically sieve the soil, and we have layers of fine particles giving way to larger particles, or the other way around. Usually it's the first. So we have fine particles, and it basically sieves down, and we end up with larger particles. And because we have the fine particles near the top, then they form, they fill up the holes, and we get less porosity near the soil surface. And finally, depositional seals, and I'll come to that in a sec. So a depositional crust. So let's say we have a little bit of erosion, and the erosion is going to do what? It's going to move finer particles first, more often. And then when the erosion event is over, it deposits those sediments somewhere. And you can see in the figure here, we have a deposit of fine sediment over the top of this sort of aggregated soil structure just below. So this fine sediment then forms this thin crust, which is only just a few millimeters, less than 2 millimeters thick in this case, on top of this soil. And that's going to further impact infiltration in the future. And then finally, we have these vesicular horizons or crusts, usually formed in silt soils due to wetting and drying cycles. So we get wetting, rainfall event on a soil, that forces some of the air down into the soil because we have these sharp wetting fronts. And then what's left behind are these little bubbles, and that causes the wetting and drying cycles also cause the silt particles to orient themselves and to be forced away from these air bubbles, which causes the pore space in the other area to compact, get smaller, and so we get this crust formation. That's it.